What could make Sevilla so attractive that an entrepreneur in the U.S. would consider moving from Texas to here? Buenas tardes. Muchas gracias para recibirme tan amablemente. Estoy muy feliz estar aquí. I think I should switch into English now, don't you? It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for coming to the Free Market Roadshow. I'd like to talk about what it would take to create a Silicon Valley here in Sevilla. I've lived in Silicon Valley for the last 35 years, and I've started companies there. Some worked for a number of companies, some of which have been successful, some of which have not been. I'd like to give you a quick overview to Silicon Valley, how it came to be, and then I'd like to make the case that what you and others here in Sevilla should really be interested in is not creating another Silicon Valley in Sevilla, but rather a Texas in Sevilla. So the title of this talk should really look like this, and I'll explain that in just a moment. Many of the ideas in the talk that I'll be sharing with you today have come from my book, Unleash Your Inner Company, which is a step-by-step guide for, thank you, for discovering, launching, and scaling the ideal business for you. And I won't say much more about it, but we'll pass the book around so you can see it. Okay, so Silicon Valley is in Northern California on the San Francisco Peninsula. How many people have been to Silicon Valley here? Okay, several of us, great. It includes these cities, and also in the last 10 or 15 years, San Francisco's south of Market or SoMa area has been considered part of Silicon Valley. It's included companies like these, Twitter, Uber, Zynga, Yelp, many familiar, Salesforce, many names that you'll recognize. And here are some of the very familiar names that you'll see throughout Silicon Valley, including HP, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Intel, and so on, Apple. It's hard to say exactly when Silicon Valley got started, but it was certainly underway by the 1940s. And something that was really an important asset was Stanford University, that had a strong electrical engineering department. Fred Terman was would become the provost of the university and was a great advocate for young people to start their own businesses. The first companies that surrounded Stanford were military and defense companies that were working on things like wireless communications. So these were some of the first companies to get started: HP, Varian, Watkins Johnson, and Lockheed. The Shockley Semiconductor company moved from the east coast of the United States to Silicon Valley in the mid-1950s. William Shockley, who invented the transistor, in a very famous event in Silicon Valley's history, about half a dozen of the senior people at Shockley left and formed Fairchild Semiconductor, and that was really the beginning of the semiconductor era, the 1960s and 70s in Silicon Valley. And so companies like Intel and Zilog and lots of others emerged in the 1960s. That evolved into the microcomputer business, which saw the Apple II launch in 1977, and throughout the 80s, just a whole bunch of desktop computers and mini computers and eventually laptops, which took the place of the IBM of the mainframe computer. In the 1990s, the internet first appeared, became productized and commercialized in the dot-com boom, which climaxed in 1999, and all of that collapsed in the dot-com bust of 2000 and 2001, but the area recovered throughout the early 2000s, and with the advent of mobile devices like the iPhone and mobile apps, we're seeing another period of tremendous growth in Silicon Valley today. Along the way, biotech also became a major segment in Silicon Valley, with companies like Genentech and others that brought that whole new industry to our region. So a few things about Silicon Valley. One, it was not planned from the top down. It emerged from the bottom up. Two, its path and evolution could not be predicted, but no one could have predicted, even as late as the 1980s or 90s, that we'd have mobile devices running tons of mobile apps, as we are so familiar with today. And three, for every company that succeeds in Silicon Valley, there are many companies that fail. And this is a key aspect of Silicon Valley that I think is underappreciated and really important to understand. There's a great deal of natural selection that goes on among companies. And people are constantly experimenting, trying new things, and a very small percentage of those companies actually survive and grow to be any size. But it's those few companies that survive that drive the growth of Silicon Valley. So kind of in a nutshell, the stages were defense, integrated circuits, personal computers, the internet, and now mobile devices, and biotech at the same time. Silicon Valley is also secured by a positive feedback loop among companies, investors, suppliers, and skilled workers. These people are drawn, and companies and institutions are drawn to Silicon Valley because entrepreneurs can find investment there. Suppliers can find customers there. Companies can find suppliers and capable people. So even though there are some trends that are working against Silicon Valley, as I'll explain in just a moment, these positive feedback factors, I think, make Silicon Valley a pretty secure technological hub worldwide that I don't think is going to disappear anytime soon. But in spite of these positive trends all working in Silicon Valley's behavior, there are some recent developments that I think should influence what Sevilla and more broadly Spain think about when they're trying to create Silicon Valleys here in Spain. If you look at the demographic trends in America, you see that people and companies are leaving California, and Silicon Valley in particular, Northern California. And where are they going? They're primarily going to Texas. You can see that Texas is the are destination of migration out of California, and of the top 10 cities that are growing, major metropolitan areas in the United States, 4 of them are in Texas: Austin, Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas-Fort Worth. Now, why are companies and individuals starting to leave Silicon Valley? Well, let me suggest 2 reasons: taxes and regulation. Here's a quote. Texas is an easier place in which to conduct business, said Veronic, president of Spectrum Location Solutions. Why is that so? A lot of people think it's taxes, but in my view, the number one benefit is an easier regulatory environment. California's regulatory regime is so harsh that it causes companies to look at all kinds of states to go to. For example, there's an error on a paycheck. If there's an error on a paycheck stub, an employer can be fined. So the regulations that harm entrepreneurship and enterprise are many and distributed. This chart shows some of the regulations that I think are making life hard for companies in Silicon Valley these days, well, that I know are. And it varies from industry to industry. So if you're in software development, it may well be the limit on the number of allowed H-1B visas. That is the number of software developers that can be brought in from overseas to work for your company. If you're making medical devices, it's probably FDA, Food and Drug Administration regulations. Construction, occupational health and safety laws, aerial vehicles, the federal aviation laws, and so forth. I could go through that entire list. So one of the challenging things about regulation is there is no single regulation that's a silver bullet. If I get rid of it, I'll make it much easier for companies to grow and thereby drive economic growth in my region. No, there are lots of little bullets that have to be dealt with to really significantly change things. In many cases, it is the poorest in society who are affected by a regulatory environment and are precluded from starting their own businesses. Consider the activity and occupation of braiding hair. Everyone here is familiar with braiding hair. It's been around for millennia. Well, in over half of the U.S. states, a license is required just to braid hair. It may cost several $1,000s, depending upon which state you're in. Well, that is a huge obstacle to young black women, many of whom are the principal practitioners of hair braiding, from starting their own businesses and making a legal living. So instead, either they can't do it or they have to do it under the table, illegally. Not a good situation that builds respect for the law. So regulation often hurts the poorest in the community as much as it hurts well-established businesses. We often hear that maybe we should let government choose which industries are going to be successful and then invest in those industries. Well, I'm going to vote against that idea as well. And for evidence why, or to explain why, I'll cite two examples from the U.S. They are fossil fuels and wireless spectrum. So both of these industries were predicted by federal agencies to run out of capacity as recently as 2010 and 2011. In 2010, the Joint Chiefs of the Armed Forces predicted that the United States would run out of petroleum reserves in as little as 2 years, by 2012. Well, somehow they overlooked the fracking revolution for both oil and natural gas, which hugely expanded the United States' supply of these raw materials and turned the U.S. into a net exporter of fossil fuels. Similarly, in 2011, the Federal Communications Administration jointly announced with AT&T that we were running out of wireless bandwidth and that we needed to do something to help increase the infrastructure for wireless bandwidth. Well, somehow they overlooked the emergence of Wi-Fi, which bypasses the last some number of meters between a transmitting station and the user, so that even in very dense places like football stadia, where lots of people are receiving and transmitting messages and photographs and video, there's plenty of capacity through Wi-Fi to handle that requirement. So here again, the U.S. government completely mispredicted what was going to happen and underestimated the power of innovation. So it's hard enough for professional venture capitalists to choose the winners. Generally, VCs only get 1 out of 10 companies right. And it's the 1 out of 10 that they guess right, which is makes their or breaks their performance. Governments, of course, have lots of other factors they're trying to weigh and consider, as well as just making a good ROI financially. They're interested in what will meet with general approval and what are other goals that we're trying to accomplish socially. So these further detract from government's ability to choose winners and losers. A famous example is Solyndra. How many people here have heard of Solyndra? It was a solar energy company that made solar panels that the federal government and California state invested over $500 million in, none of which was retrieved before the company went bankrupt. So don't put taxpayers' money at risk, in my view, here in Spain. So what can Spain and Sevilla do to create the next Silicon Valley or Texas, as the case may be? Well, what's usually suggested is things like investing in entrepreneurship programs and training and business plan competitions and elevator pitch competitions. I call that entrepreneurship theater, or maybe short-term tax cuts to promote companies to moving to the region. People figure out very quickly what is genuine and what isn't. And if you have a short-term tax incentive of, say, 3 to 5 years that encourages a company to open a plant here, or it might be fine for 3 to 5 years, but as soon as the tax benefits go away after that time, they're likely to pick up and move somewhere else, aren't they? So anything we do needs to be genuine and sustained for the long term. From an entrepreneurial standpoint, rather than to encourage entrepreneurship, rather than those business plan competitions and elevator pitch competitions and the opportunity to win free trips to Brussels, I'm going to vote against something there as well. And what I would recommend instead is focusing on the climate and environment here in Sevilla. Here's some specific suggestions. Have the lowest taxes, not just within Spain, and not just within all of the EU, but within the world. How could Sevilla possibly have the lowest taxes? I don't know. I don't know to what extent there's independence from Spain. But consider that you're competing not just with other regions of Spain, and not just within other countries in the EU like Estonia or Ireland, but other parts of the world like Texas. What could make Sevilla so attractive that an entrepreneur in the U.S. would consider moving from Texas to here? That, whatever it would take, that would be a winning formula. So taxes are one broad set of things. What are the other tool at our disposal is the regulatory environment. How can we make the regulations as clear, unobtrusive, and simple as possible so that there's the most predictability for a business, and so it's the most inviting for a business, so that they don't have to worry about all those issues that I listed before, H-1B visas and Food and Drug Administration, or as minimally as possible. Would it be possible to create a special economic zone in Sevilla or the broader region here, which was relatively free of regulation and had lower taxes? I don't know, but especially for the young people in the room who will be the leaders of this region over the next 5 to 10 years, start thinking about it now. And start thinking how you could build the momentum and the case so that when you do enter positions of leadership, you'll be better equipped and in a strong position and have your ideas all really clear for what's the best way to go about it. Protect private property. The people are naturally incentivized to invest in and develop what they own, either for their own use or to sell to somebody else. If private property isn't protected, they lose that incentive, don't they? And not protecting private property could mean either having an environment which is so corrupt that private property isn't honored and respected, or it could mean that the regulatory environment is so complex that it's so fuzzy that you can't tell what you're allowed to do with your private property or not. Either one of those you'd want to avoid to protect private property. Finally, use sunset clauses. What do I mean by that? A sunset clause is a clause in a regulation that says it expires after some number of years, say 5 years. The world, technology, innovation are constantly changing, and they're changing at an accelerating rate. And so what's true now may not be true or applicable 5 years from now. So if we make a new law now, let's say it will be in effect for 5 years. And that if we're going to renew it, it has to be explicitly renewed 5 years from now. Otherwise, it sunsets. That is, that regulation goes away. And that's a way to keep the regulations from amassing and accumulating and being an obstacle to economic growth, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Well, those are some thoughts and suggestions. One really good metric is the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index. How many people are familiar with it? The World Bank each year assesses how easy it is to do business in 190 different countries or regions in the world. And it ranks them from number 1, the best, to number 190, the worst. Well, Spain right now ranks around 32. As you can, I don't know if you can read it there. The composite is a composite of 10 or 12 different factors, like how easy is it to get a business license? How easy is it to protect minority investors in a company? How easily can you get electricity and so forth? Well, here is a very tangible goal that people here in Spain can rally around. Whatever our current ranking is, and currently it's 32 on the list out of 190, let's make it a goal to cut that rank in half in 5 years. So our goal is to move from number 32 to number 16 on the World Bank's chart in the next 5 years. That's an aggressive goal, but it's an achievable goal. There are other countries that have made that kind of dramatic move. And that is a move and goal that will benefit every single person in Sevilla and in Spain. So, muchas gracias for having me, and I look forward to talking further with you during the break. Thanks.